And artillery is always focused on infantry because you have to stop the enemy coming to you, and it's the artillery that has the capacity to do that. The infantry is the queen of battle. The infantry has the capacity to go anywhere. The queen in chess has the capacity to go anywhere. Now the tanks are the knights of battle. They have the combination of power and mobility. The infantry has mobility, but they don't have the power. And the queen has to be protected because she is so important. She can go anywhere, and but the queen is the most decisive piece on the board, and so the infantry is the decisive piece, but it needs support. So we have those combinations: power, mobility, and the combination of the two. So we want to pay tribute to the 912 Field Artillery because they work very closely with the 347th and were instrumental in this success. It is important to know that artillery is so important that it rates a brigadier general. And Brigadier General Ford is the one who conceived the aerial observation, that is the little spotter planes that would go out and find targets that you could hit. And he developed that whole system for the Army, and so he is the originator of that concept, and we were blessed to have him. An interesting sidelight, General Patton came to General Cullen and General Ford and talking about crossing the Rhine. And Patton was very knowledgeable about everything in Europe, and you may know that he was the chief of the tank battalions, American Tank Corps, in World War I. Anyway, so he was very familiar with the Rhine, so when getting close to the Rhine, right at the Deutsches Eck, that is the corner of Germany where the Moselle and the Rhine come together, there is this grand statue of a horseman, probably one of the Wilhelms of Germany. And so he asked General Cullen if he could knock that SOB off the pedestal. And so he and General Ford readily agreed it would be a pleasure to do that. And so for a long time, that horse and rider were over on their side due to the accuracy of our artillery. There was a battle in which we secured the high ground, and there was a lot of expenditure of nervous energy because we had not been in battle before. We didn't know what to expect. We were dug in. The Germans, as any good army would do, would test a new division to see what their mettle was, to see what their experience was. And we had scouts out, and these scouts were, you have to remember that these men were very, very tired. They worked very long and hard to get to the point that they found themselves. And German patrols came through and garroted the outposts. Everybody know what garroting is? Anyone doesn't know what a garroting is? That is a strap around the neck where not even a sound can be uttered, and the wind is cut off, and the person is simply strangled to death without a single sound. So then they came up upon us with Burp guns and with bayonets, and we quickly decided that anyone above ground was no friend of ours. And so we fired away as best we could. But they were overwhelming. And so Major Chapman, who was the commanding officer of the battalion, decided we'd have to have artillery. Again, we need the artillery in times of crisis. So he called in the coordinates and shelled the top of the hill, and that drove the Germans off and saved what was left of the group. Now, after the war, Jim Armour, who was our GAN editor, was very good at finding people by his email, internet, and all that sort of thing. And he found Robert Cobb in Phoenix, Arizona. Boy, I picked up the phone, called Robert Cobb. It turns out Robert Cobb is a physician, but his father was Colonel Robert B. Cobb. Wonderful. He's living where? Phoenix City, Arizona. So we got a hold of him there, and we have been in touch with him over a certain period of time until he passed away. And he was a great source of information to us on the 1st Battalion, 347. So I asked him, how long did it take? Because he came to us about the 1st or 2nd day of January. Colonel Chapman, Major Chapman having been transferred to the 3rd Battalion. I said, how long did it take before we got back to full strength? He said it wasn't until the last month or two before we could get up to full strength. We would keep getting replacements, and you'd lose more replacements than you would veteran soldiers, but it was very hard to get up to strength. So it wasn't until that time they got close to up to strength, full strength. This is a very good example of a group of men, and they have to carry everything, and pretty soon they really make decisions about what's worth keeping and what's worth throwing away. And the first thing we threw away was the gas masks. They were cumbersome, and we sort of concluded after a while they weren't going to use gas, so we threw them away. And I don't know about everybody, but all the rest, but I was concerned about keeping enough food, and I would squirrel away an extra meat can if I could get one, and crackers and toilet paper, good to keep. And in all of your ration things, they would have some toilet paper in, and they'd usually have, it was brown, of course. You wouldn't want the enemy spotting white paper, would you? They would have a clue as to where you were. And they would have usually a little bit of chocolate, and it was enough to keep you going, let's put it that way. Now, I'm not too familiar with the 912 Field Artillery, except to say that they're tremendously valuable. So if we have a 912 man here, we're certainly open to his contribution. One of the interesting things about the artillery was the fact that we had these 57 millimeters, and they didn't seem to be very effective. So right after the SAR, they were discarded. We never saw them again. And also in the SAR, we had light tanks. Now, the strange thing about a light tank was the armor was so thin that when an 88 hit it, it went right through it. Didn't explode, just went right through it. But it was very demoralizing for tank men to get that kind of a reception. So they were soon discarded. And then in our tanks, the Sherman tanks, we really didn't think that they were as good as the German tanks. But American soldiers are very creative. And I think it's because just the American character. We started out on the East Coast, and nobody really helped us. We had to build our own society. If you come from the Midwest, a lot of farmers there, and you have to be able to fix stuff. You can't call in and have somebody come out and fix something. You have to fix it yourself or it's not going to get fixed. And so Americans are used to innovative solutions to problems. And so they figured out ways to have bazookas disable tanks. And they would do that by hitting the bogies or hitting them in a vulnerable place. One of the things when we come to the Dragon's Teeth, the great advantage of that is it'll cause a tank to be pushed up into the air, and it's vulnerable on the underside, and these pyramids are truncated, and it's just almost impossible to get over those. And I might add also, it's impossible to get those dragon teeth out of the ground. They're still there, and bushes and trees have grown up over those, and they're still there, and the farmers work around them as best they can. So they're combinations of cement and steel, and so well done that it takes too much effort to try to blast them apart. There was one part at the front, at the beginning, I missed, and I want to go back to that. I wanted to say a word about the timeline here. World War I ended in 1918, and it was a very onerous peace that we placed on the Germans. Now, the French were very angry, very vengeful, because they lost an entire generation in World War I. The British lost the cream of their youth in World War I. Why? Because both sides believed that attrition was the way to win the war. And all they did was have a standoff. And until the Americans came in with tanks that could override barbed wire and trenches, that was the breakthrough. So when the armistice came, the Germans had to pay dearly, and their economy was wretched for a long time. During this period in which Hitler was rising, he was violating the Versailles Treaty. They had glider clubs, they had Boy Scout clubs, and all these things were just precursors of their military operation. And so, I think it was early 1938, Hitler told his general staff that they were going to take Alsace-Lorraine. And the general staff was aghast. Said, if we do that, and the French, with a 1 million-man army, the largest army in Europe, if they move on us, we cannot defend the fatherland. But Hitler said, I will take care of that aspect. You take Alsace-Lorraine. Now, what Hitler knew was, because of the informants that he had in France and England, the desire for peace was so great, the disinclination to stop a violation of the Versailles Treaty was so great that Churchill said, I could give speeches around the country and no one would even bother to come to listen. There was that lack of interest. And this is one of the most difficult things. Suppose for a minute that France had acted and prevented the Germans from doing that. It might have nipped the whole thing in the bud right to begin with. But what happens, we have to wait until the danger is so great that we can all see it, and then we say, yes, now we can act. And we did, but at the cost of 40, 50, maybe 60 million people. And so this is one of the debates that's going on today. When do you squelch a dictator or a hostile force when it's small, or do you attack it when it's so big that you can't avoid it anymore. So this is always an ongoing issue. In 1938, they walked into Austria. It was the Flower Revolution. They had flowers in the rifle barrels. It was an agreed takeover. Hitler met with Kurt Schuschnigg, who was the Chancellor of Austria, and said, and laid down what was going to happen. He made him an offer he couldn't refuse. And so they went into Austria. In 1939, you remember Neville Chamberlain came back from Munich with a piece of paper and he said, "Peace in our time." Now they both agreed on the word peace, but they spelled it different. Neville Chamberlain spelled it P-E-A-C-E, and Hitler spelled it P-I-E-C-E. And Hitler wanted a piece of this country and a piece of that country and a piece of another country, and they just disagreed on what piece they were talking about. So he said that his last territorial demand in Europe was Sudetenland, because German citizens were being abused by the Czech government, and if they just let him have that, that would be his last territorial demand. And so Neville Chamberlain came back to London, exultant with this piece of paper, and as far as Hitler was concerned, that's all it was, a piece of paper. And so he went took over the rest of Czechoslovakia, and then the democracies finally realized that we just have to stop this guy. So when he went across the border into Poland, a fortunate thing happened for the Allies. The Enigma machine of the German army, that encoding device, which could send messages in secret and no one could divine what they were. A copy of the encoding machine, the Enigma, was spirited over to England and to Bletchford Park, where they had the best minds in England working on it. And that was the beginning of the computer age, because what they put together to break the Enigma machine became the computer. And you recall the computers used to be an entire room this big. You'd have a computer this big to do all the calculations. And finally, I guess today you can have them in the palm of your hand. So that is a step there. Now, Germany, as they went through the rest of Europe there, there's one comment on the Maginot Line. The French, having this defensive attitude, we don't want to attack anybody, but we'll build this Maginot Line, this impregnable defense that'll go all the way around to protect us, and then nobody can attack us, principally Germany. Well, when they got to the Belgian border, they said, "Oh no, that would be an act of war if you do that. It's a hostile act. These guns are pointed at us." So they deferred to the Belgians and didn't build it. So, I mean, how good is the line if you leave it open in the far side? So they came right around there, and in matter of fact, 6 or 7 guys, paratroopers, jumped on the line at Sedan and stuffed hand grenades and smoke and all kinds of things down the vents of the Maginot Line and disabled the place. Just walked over the top, and here all these guns are pointed east, and the Germans are already west of it. And so, offense is the best defense. And so that is a concept that was U.S. Army has had since the time of Ulysses S. Grant. Okay, then moving on, we go through. We have troops arrive in North Africa. The commander that we had, Colonel Robert B. Cobb, his first action was in North Africa. He was a first lieutenant. And his captain was killed, and he became a captain. And then when they got beaten at El Gatar, there was a critique conducted by the Brigadier General of the division that he was in, and he discovered that Colonel Cobb said to the other line company captains, as you go back, I will cover your retreat so that you can get back to a safe position. When he saw the level of responsibility and insightfulness of Colonel Cobb, they made him a major. Then shortly after that, Patton came to North Africa, and his battalion commander said, "They've got me going on a suicide mission. Be prepared to take over the battalion." And his battalion commander was killed, and he became a lieutenant colonel. All that happened in 14 months. So you see, ladies and gentlemen, you can rise quickly in the military if the circumstances are right. So Cobb came to us from there and from Sicily, and we got an experienced battle commander. Now, when he came to our regimental colonel, Tupper, Tupper looked at him and thought to himself, you know, this is a really young guy. What if he knows what he's doing? And Cobb said, "Are the men firing all their ammunition?" And when he heard that question, he knew this man knew what he was talking about. There's a reluctance sometimes of soldiers to fire their weapons. As a matter of fact, when we first came into the line, there was this feeling, remember, a lot of 18, 19, 20-year-old guys, and a feeling, you know, if they don't fire at us, or if we don't fire at them, maybe they won't fire at us, you know. But it didn't take long to be disabused of that idea, and that we're not going to have a committee meeting on this whole issue. That it was just, as Walter Ehlers, the Medal of Honor winner from Normandy, said, it's just when a lady said to him, "How can you, as a Christian, how can you kill your fellow man?" And he lowered his voice, very gentle, to this lady. He said, "Ma'am, it's really very simple. Just kill or be killed." And that's what we finally discovered. That's what it was all about, just kill or be killed. Now, we get to France, I guess in late November. Now bring us up to the point where we should be there. We come across the channel, and we are at Le Havre, and then we get on the box cars, and they say 40 and 8. Is there anyone who is not a veteran know what that means, 40 and 8? It looks like a fraction, a 40 and a line and an 8, you know. You feel like maybe you're in the 4th grade and they're doing fractions. Well, what does that mean? Does anybody have an idea what 40 and over 8 means?
40 men or 8 horses.
Yes, it's 40 hommes and 8 chevaux. 40 men or 8 horses. And the American Legion, after World War I, formed this group called the Society of 40 and 8, which was sort of an honor and fun group of the American Legion. And they used that group. And so every man in this room has probably ridden a 40 and 8 in the World War II, just as they did in World War I. So we get to where we're going, which is Metz, and then some units are cleaning out some forts, Drian and one of the other ones I can't think of. And then our first action is in the Saar. It's I've forgotten exactly the name of the town, but I was talking with Bob Royce, who was in the back of the room. He was a staff sergeant in Headquarters Company 1st Battalion, and I was telling him about the first day of combat. And I was to get the company up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and we did approximately that time. And so we're in reserve and we're waiting for a call forward. And I'm looking down across this meadow, and there's a group of 8 men all collected together, and my infantry training tells me you should be dispersed, not bunch up like that. Right next to them is a big deciduous tree without any leaves, of course, in November. It's a nice big tree, well formed, and suddenly I hear a whir and an explosion, and the 8 men have disappeared. But their flesh and their fabric of their clothing are festooned all over the tree like it was a Christmas tree. And then you begin to understand at a level you've never understood before what it means. And then a short time later, a light tank came back from the front, and there was a half a body, just the bottom half of the body from the waist down, hanging on the deck of the tank. And you realize, you know, these people don't like us. And so at any rate, the SAR is a difficult place because it is the Germans' home territory. And you have the trees, and you have the ridges and the valley, and you're trying to force them out of an area that they're very familiar with. Now, last October, my younger son and I went over there to see some of the places that we fought. And the first place we went to was the Saar. We wanted to go to Obergeelbach, Niedergeelbach, and Walsheim. And all 3 of those towns are dominantly German, completely German. But Obergeelbach is on the high ground, and that is inside France. But there are practically no boundaries anymore. And it would just be the same as if you're driving in the States. You can go from one country to another, and it doesn't even matter anymore. And we got to, so I could show Charlie just the kind of terrain that we had to fight through. And then we got to Niedergeelbach, and it was founded in 1050. 1050. They celebrated their 850th anniversary in the year 2000. Then we got to Walsheim, and we discovered they were formed or created in 888. So in 1988, they celebrated their 1100th anniversary. Well, I went to the church where I had a meeting with a German artillery shell. There was a church that was prominent, and the Germans would use that as a takeoff point. They go up and down the street. The first shell would land there, and then they go up and down the street depending on what target they were looking for. Well, my buddy was named Elmer Gedke, and we were in the middle of the street, and we heard this whir, and I knew it was going to be close. But Gedke didn't seem to be paying as much attention to the whir as I was, so I pushed him down, and we got flat on the street, and it hit a little bit ahead of us, or in front of us, and went through this window that had been knocked out, and all this shrapnel was against the back wall. So I wanted to show Charlie this exact spot where this event occurred. Now, you'd think they'd keep things the same for us just so we could have this event. But we got there, and they had made a residential unit section out of that side of the street opposite the church. There was no way you could find anything except you had your church reference point there. But they had saved a building that was pockmarked with shrapnel and bullets and stuff like that, so the populace could remember what happened, or future generations could be aware of what happened. Now, the night that we had to pull out of the SAR, It was tremendously cold, and we could not get the trails of a 57mm cannon to come together. So we put it on its side. Everybody jumped up on one of the trails and just hammered it down as much as we could. We finally got it so we could hook it up to the truck. And I don't know what day that was. It probably was around the 23rd, 24th of December. And that whole planning, that entire trip, moving an entire division of approximately 20,000 men on short notice, moving them 180 miles north, required a tremendous amount of logistical planning, and to gather the trucks and to move at night. Now, during the day, we stopped in a sheltered area, and on Christmas Day, we had a hot meal. And that was great. I'm sitting on a snowbank, and I've got my turkey and my peas and stuffing and mashed potato, and I'm eating it as fast as I can before it gets frozen. And the general, the brigadier general of the division was given a Bronze Star for that excellent planning that moved the division so quickly and effortlessly up there. So, but we're going along at night, and suddenly we're attacked by the Luftwaffe. And I'm asking the audience to consider, if you are a fighter pilot and you look down and you see a little, what I would say, caterpillar feet, that is these little rectangular slits of light. That's all you can see. But they're moving in a serpentine fashion over a road net. Well, if you're a fighter pilot, you know you've got a convoy. So you circle around to the head of the convoy, and with your 20mm cannon and your 50 caliber machine guns all synchronized to hit the target you're pointing at, you blow up the first truck in line and nobody else can go anywhere. So you go up and down, strafing the convoy. Now, I got wounded in that event, jumped out of the truck like everybody else did, and tried to fire at the plane. Now, an infantryman can shoot down a plane, but I'd never make a bet on it. It is so rare. You'd have to hit a magneto or some critical thing to make the plane fail. They go so fast and so far. At any rate, the adrenaline is high, and someone says, "What did you do? You're bleeding." And I look down in the snow, and there's a splotch of red there. And about 20 minutes later, I'm on an operating room looking up at a white light above me instead of looking at the white below. And the surgeon is just encouraging me to keep telling about what's happening until the anesthetic takes over. So after the operation, I'm down on the hospital bed, and I'm thinking to myself, this is Christmas night. I am alive. I'm in a warm bed. And suddenly the surgeon comes by and he brings me a drumstick. And I'm thinking, this guy is telling me, you're one lucky guy just to be here. But I'm thinking to myself, I'm alive, I'm in a warm bed, I've had 2 servings of turkey on Christmas Day, all things considered, not a bad thing. So, you know, you make the best out of things, you know, you get a good outlook on things. Well, 4 days later, I'm back with the 87th up in the Bulge. We've been in shape reserve for 3 or 4 days, and now we're up in the line there, and we're probably, let's see, okay, now we're in the Bulge. There is we had a night march through the woods. I don't remember exactly where. It was so cold, we were so tired, It was hard to lift your one foot up against the other, but there was no choice. You just had to keep going. And finally we got there, and I'm trying to think, where the hell am I going to sleep tonight? You know, you can't dig anything, and I find a sleeping bag. I crawl into a sleeping bag, and I'm out like a light. And then after a few hours, I'm up again. Now, fast forward to 1995, 50 years later. I'm coming home from work, and my wife says, "You got a call from NBC in New York." I said, "Honey, I don't know anybody in NBC in New York." She said, "Well, it sounds like it's important. I think you ought to call them back." So I call them back, and they say they're going to do a retrospective on infantrymen on the 50th anniversary of VE Day. And I understand that the 87th Infantry Division is going over for the 50th anniversary, and that you're one of the men that's going. And I said, yes. They said, well, we're interviewing 13 men, and we're going to pick 3 to interview in Paris on the 50th anniversary of VE Day. So what do? They give me a tough question. They say, why does the Army pick 18 and 19-year-olds? And my answer was, these are the best soldiers you can get. They recover quickly from fatigue and wounds. They think they're immortal. They are still in the learning stage. They can be, they can adjust to changing conditions. They see a certain sense of adventure. They want to be men. They want to earn their stripes as a man. So they thought that was sufficient. So they called me back and said I was going to be one of the 3 men to be interviewed on May 8th, 1995 in Paris. So we get there, we go to REM, we're interviewed in front of the REM Cathedral. Now right in front of REM is a great block of granite, and on the first line on the top is the name of Konrad Adenauer, and below that is the name of Charles de Gaulle. And what did they do? They signed a pact that they would not go to war with each other again. These 2 countries had fought each other over hundreds of years back and forth, and they solemnized that agreement by worshiping together at the Roman Catholic Cathedral at Rome. And I thought, you know, how appropriate the spiritual underpinnings of an important decision. You remember that Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt met on the Prince of Wales after they had signed their agreements, and sang these great Anglican hymns, and it's sort of a spiritual confirmation of what they had agreed to do. Later, the Prince of Wales was in the Pacific Theater and sunk by Japanese with all hands lost. But at any rate, then later that day, we went to Paris, and we're at the one of the main hotels, and we were supposed to be in front of the Eiffel Tower in about 20 minutes for NBC's weekend edition. And so the chauffeur finally gets us there. They make us up, sit us down, and ask some questions, and so we have the fun of being part of that special day, and they give us a nice lunch at a nice restaurant, and then this particular event, this day, was the greatest assemblage of chiefs of state and heads of government since the funeral of Queen Victoria in 1901. We had Al Gore from the United States. We had Jacques Chirac, who was just elected to be the Premier of France. Many monarchs and every major country represented there. Then, suddenly, coming down the Champs-Élysées were the military units of all the Allied armies. Was that stirring? Was that stirring? And our unit playing the Stars and Stripes Forever. I mean, that was a great day to be a soldier. That was a great day to be a veteran. But most of all, it was a great day to be an American. So, I've digressed a bit. We have, when we come to the Moselle River, there was a sign on the other side of the Moselle that said, "See Germany and die." Well, at some point, an enterprising GI got around to taking out the article between that and that expression, so it just said, "See Germany die." That seemed to be more appropriate. Colonel Cobb was led that attack. He killed 2 men, captured 13 men, and he said it was fortunate for us because they caught 2 units in a changeover, and so there was some confusion. So he received the Distinguished Service Cross for that brave and successful achievement. Now we get over to the Rhine, and we're at the Deutsches Eck, which is called the corner of Germany, and that is the confluence of the Moselle and the Rhine rivers. And the one you hear the most about was the Remagen bridgehead, which is immediately north of us, where everybody got across and there was very little injury, and it was a fortunate breakthrough to get through there. But we crossed at Rennes, and that's a night crossing, and the enemy is waiting for us. Did they shell the west bank of the Rhine? No, they weren't going to hurt their own buildings. They were going to wait till we got on the water. Now, if you're going across on the water, the Rhine is a swift-flowing river, and so you have to tack your boat into the current in order to get to the spot you want to be. That makes it a longer passage over there. Well, sometime after midnight, a shot was fired. I don't know that anybody knows which side fired the shot, probably not very important. But then flares started to come down. It's sort of an antiseptic white, slowly floating down, just illuminates everything. And as someone has mentioned earlier, maybe it was you, John, I don't know, but that they had the 20mm cannon depressed, they had machine guns, they had everything really focused on that. Now, years later, I talked with Colonel Cobb and I said, can you give me some casualty figures on that? He said, we lost 80% on the first wave, and we lost 40% in the second wave, and 20% in the third wave. Now, can a non-veteran tell me why our losses would be less in the second and third waves? Yes.
I would think that the troops that made survivors of the first wave helped take out the artillery on the other side.
Now that's exactly right. The survivors of the first wave start to button down the enemy by returning fire, and they don't have free shots at you anymore. And so then you have more coming, and of course the fire intensifies. Now, a strange thing happened. We had a veteran company, a line officer, who was eligible for a pass to Paris, and he took it and went to Paris. Well, then they had to go to the officer pool to get someone else to lead C Company across the Rhine. Well, what happened is that this officer was intoxicated. And when he got across the Rhine with his men, he said, he threatened them and said, you got to go over that railroad that ran along the eastern edge of the Rhine, or I'll shoot you. Somehow the information got to Colonel Cobb. He came over to the officer, took his weapon, said, you're under arrest. He was sent back to Major Withers. He was court-martialed and sentenced to 30 years at Leavenworth. So there is conduct that is very unacceptable, threatening men, not leading them properly, and that was the price for that. But through the night, we went up the sides there, got up to the top, and then a strange thing occurred. At the last minute, some Germans threw up their hands, but they were shot anyway. You're not supposed to do that, but in the heat of battle, these things happen. So the 1st Battalion received a Distinguished Unit Citation for that assault crossing of the Rhine River. According to 3rd Army historians, that was the most difficult of the 13 Rhine crossings. And that was probably right next to the easiest Rhine crossing, the one I just described at the Remagen Bridge. Now, I tell you an amusing incident. The last town that we took was just near Plauen, and it'll come to me. At any rate, I'm walking down the street, and I'm seeing this official-looking German, and he's got some great fruit salad. He's got some great decorations on his chest. And I'm thinking, these should be liberated. And so I go up to him, and he hands me a note. The note is from Colonel Cobb. Said, this man is under orders to maintain the order in this town. Do not disturb or harm him in any way. Signed, Robert B. Cobb. Gee. That ended that thing. We were actually more afraid of Colonel Cobb than we were the Germans. We knew the Germans didn't like us, but Colonel Cobb, he had control over us every day. So I know there's some others who have got comments to make here. Oh yeah. Jules, why don't you tell about your experience? Jules Korn has a most unusual experience because he was with his unit from the very beginning to the very end. And Jules, tell us about that experience.
Actually, I'm going to take a different tack than my friend Fred over here. In other words, what I'm going to pick are stories that pertain to stories that I would tell perhaps nobody else but one or two other GIs was familiar with. And of course it was never discussed after the war, which was partly the government's fault from what I understand, because they told us as GIs, don't talk about the war. And most of us did not. And of course some of us suffered psychological problems. All right, now what initially took place is we wound up in the Saar Basin. And the first day in combat, we get out of our holes, and there are 3 German tanks standing there. And of course, even if we had a bazooka, we couldn't have stopped them. There were three of us. And one of them's name was Mac, the other one was Jesse Bordelon, and the third one was me. And we were lying down on top of the ground, just a couple of feet away from the tank, where the tank couldn't depress machine guns to fire at us. So we just laid there, did absolutely nothing, and waited. After a while, 3 tanks pulled out. But prior to that time, he was firing 88s at us, and we had just awakened, were half frozen. And as a result, some men got killed. Now, lying in front of, or on the side of the tank, I had just turned my head to the left when the tank fired an 88 and killed one of our VAR guys. And unfortunately, that carried over to the end of the war, where I made it a personal effort to visit the parents and tell them that their son Gene died instantaneously, no pain, no nothing, and it was a horror because he didn't even get a chance to do anything at all. He was a VAR guy. Either he lost him mentally or some way, and fired at the tank, and the bullets bounced off. And then the tank turned around. Don't believe that the tank commander was aiming at him, but he fired the 88, and he decapitated him instantly. All right. The next day, after sleeping and freezing, we are going to take the town, the first town in Germany, and the first actual town that we took. And in order to get there, we had to take the high ground, which obviously, all of you know, that's what we did when we started out. We took the high ground. Now, to get to the high ground, we had a road which was dug in at a slant to reach up to the woods, and the ground now was above us, so anything coming in couldn't hit us, it would go over our heads. So we're now on the road. Part of the guys had run out, and what they did, of course, was loot. They tried to collect whatever they could. At that time, I was a gunner on a 60 mortar, and my squad was looting. So I went in and I cleared them all out, get back on the road and get up to the high ground. And my assistant gunner was dragging himself. He was pooped because of the snow and the mud and carrying the gun. I saw he was dragging himself, and I said to him, "Warren, you want me to help you?" So he said, "Sure." Gave me the gun. And I got back in line, I'm going to climb the hill. And then sometimes later, I'm on the ground. I look up. The company is about 2 blocks on the other side. What had happened is that the concussion had taken me out, and nobody came back to check on me. Nobody. So I finally get up to where the company is, and I get a hold of Mac, who was section leader of the mortar, and I said to him, "Mac, what do you want me to set up the gun?" He says, "Corn, forget it." I said, "What do you mean, forget it?" He says, "When the report came up that you got hit, the guys threw away the ammo."
Oh, jeez.
Would you believe that? It actually happened. They threw away the ammo, and I couldn't use the weapon at all. And Warren and I dug the foxhole together, and the following day, in comes an 88. He gets wounded and gets scratched. So what I was talking about earlier about things that happened that were personal, rather than generally as far as the company was concerned, or the squad, or whatever. And now, as a result, for some reason or other, the sergeant in charge of the squad disappeared. Don't know what happened to him. I was next in line. So I suddenly became a sergeant and commanded 60 millimeter squad, which eventually I not only commanded it, I worked it because everybody else got wounded or killed. Unbelievable, yes. So then I became a sergeant, and I became one to pick the target, one to shoot the gun, etc., etc.
What ammunition did you use?
I didn't have any. I didn't have any. Unbelievable. But what irked me the most was they saw me lying on the road. Send somebody down to see whether I was dead or alive or wounded, and do it. Second, if you didn't want to do that, at least pick up the gun and take it to where it's supposed to go. Didn't do that either. So what we had basically was two of us. One fired the gun, the other one loaded it, and the others carried ammo on it. So they couldn't operate anything. And when they thought I got hurt, they got rid of the weight, which was about 35 pounds, and they felt great about it. All right.
How old were you?
I'm sorry.
How old were you at that time?
19.
19. Oh my God.
Well, what subsequently happened is that we took a tremendous beating in the Saw Basin. Out of the entire company of almost 200 guys, we came back with 45. And that was a horror. And then, of course, we got, in the first week in January, we got replacements. And they told me at the time that they were in the United States at Christmas time. They were put on a plane and flown over. They were undertrained, and they were basically a detriment because they didn't have complete basic training. That was the time they pulled them out because we had lost so many men. And they were a danger to themselves and to their buddies as a result. At any rate, we finally got some of the replacements in who were able to train in a manner of speaking. And subsequently, we were involved in trying to take freedom break. And what happened, of course, is that we never got up because the sniper stopped us in the midfield. The attack plan, personally, was a squad of riflemen, a squad of machine gun medic, and then me with the mortar. And what had transpired is that we got stuck in like a defilade, which probably was a pond or something in the wintertime, which was down deep, and the sniper couldn't hit us because the bullets would go flying over. But the guys were laying out in the field, yelling medic and medic. Every time we sent somebody in, they got shot. So we had to stop and wait until nightfall to get out of there. And what transpired with me personally was I dug the hole with Delma Johnson, who was in headquarters company, came from the States, so we knew each other way back. And basically, in those days, I didn't want to dig a hole with any of my own people, because if something happened to them, I got emotionally involved oftentimes. So I picked Delma, and Delma picked me, and dug a hole in the side of the road. And after 2 or 3 days of melting snow and eating it, we were told to move up towards the wooded area. And we got there, and the order came down, dig in. So I told my guys at that time to start digging the foxhole. And Delma Johnson called over from where he was digging and said, Julie, you want to dig in with me again? The ground here seems a little bit softer. It'd be easier to dig a foxhole. But as soon as I take care of my own men, I'll be over Delma. So I take care of my squad, and then I go over where Delma is on his hands and knees digging. I'm standing in back of him looking over his shoulder. And I said, Del, I have to go to the bathroom, I'll be right back. And then comes an armor piercing, hits him in the face, goes right past me by an inch or so. I didn't even get the blood flow, and he was dead instantly.